you to the Fabian Dorsch Essay Prize panel for awarding me a great honour of this distinction. And to Mark Winslow for his very helpful comments. It's a great pity that Mark can't be with us today, but I hope that he has certainly probed my arguments very closely, and I hope that my response to his comments will also elucidate my arguments there where they aren't clear enough in their own right. Okay, so let's start off with the following common sense observation. Many different things are used. So we have Yosemite National Park in California, and we have the Norfolk Broads in England. Now, these are two places that are very beautiful, or they have great aesthetic value. But we may also be tempted to say that they have different kinds of aesthetic value. That's an idea that people find very appealing. So, okay, if they have different kinds of aesthetic value, then what are these kinds? So here's a natural explanation. Well, you may say that, well, Yosemite is majestic and sublime and powerful and raw, while the Norfolk Broads are tranquil and mellow and melancholy. We could give more words to describe the differences in the kinds of value that they have, kinds of aesthetic value that they have. And these sorts of properties to which we appeal, so majesty, sublimity, tranquility, mellowness, they tend to be called by philosophers aesthetic properties, or at least that's sort of the going jargon. What exactly goes onto the list isn't clear, but I hope that it's clear enough what sort of thing should go onto the list. Okay, so when describing differences in kinds of aesthetic value, we appeal to aesthetic properties. Now, from this, it's a very short step to the following claim, which I'm going to call the kind thesis. Aesthetic properties are kinds of aesthetic value. So, to give more detail to this claim, what we want to say is that elegance is a kind of aesthetic goodness. For example, garishness, or gaudiness, or monotony, they're kinds of aesthetic badness. So, like, to add some substance here, we'd say that positive aesthetic properties, like elegance, are kinds of aesthetic goodness. Negative aesthetic properties, like garishness, are kinds of aesthetic badness. Now, the kind thesis has been popular and has some pretty prominent supporters. So Dominic Lopez endorses it explicitly in Being for Beauty. He also attributes the view to Frank Sidney, which this is a reading that I'm not sure that I agree, although I won't go into detail on this point. Nick Zangel has argued for different versions of this view over the last 30 years, and has endorsed it more explicitly more recently. Władysław Tatarkiewicz also endorsed it in some of his historical writing. Now, I'm going to argue that the kind thesis is false. I'm going to argue that aesthetic properties are not kinds of aesthetic value. And that we should believe that, even if we think that different aesthetically valuable things can at least sometimes have different kinds of aesthetic value. Okay, so let's start with clarifying what the kind thesis means. And the first question is, what is it to be a kind? Now, I take being kind to be an ordinary language concept. So, like, to be a kind that exists to be a sort of X, or a type, or a species, or a variety. That's an ordinary notion that I think we have a certain grasp on. But I'll illustrate it with some examples. So, for example, scarlet is a kind of red. We'll say that red is a kind of colour. So sometimes kinds have this layered structure. A square is a kind of rectangle. Again, you could say rectangle is a kind of shape. And a ginger cat is a kind of cat. Now, I do think that we can give a more substantial metaphysical account of what the relationship of kinds is. But I'm not going to do that here, not because I don't think that an account can be given, but just because it's not necessary for our points to go through. So I think that the arguments as I give them only require us to understand kindhood as this sort of ordinary concept. That is philosophically interesting. Now there is one feature of kindhood that my arguments will exploit, but this is pretty uncontroversial. In fact, it's entirely uncontroversial. So it's the following feature. I'm going to call it kind inheritance. So for any property P, whatever has a kind of P, thereby has P. So, for example, if something has a kind of colour, then it thereby has colour. And if something is a kind of cat, then it is a cat. I think that's just a simple conceptual truth about the way we use the word kinds. I mean, I can't see any competent user of the concept of kind denying this. So I think this is like a pretty strong foundation for any argument to rely on. And I should emphasize that this is a strictly sufficient condition. So it's not that being kind of P is a consideration in favour of being P. It's an ironclad guarantee. Like, think, how could something be a kind of cat without being a cat? One last clarification. What is aesthetic value? I'm not assuming any account. I just understand aesthetic value as beauty understood very broadly. Some philosophers may want to understand it more broadly than others. But I won't assume much about aesthetic value. Okay, why should we care about the kind thesis? Why should we care whether it's true? So I think there are three reasons. So if the kind thesis is true, then we can at least approach a definition or characterization of aesthetic properties. So like I gave the long list of like elegance, melancholy, garishness, delicacy, etc., etc. And we can have a certain grip on what an aesthetic property is via such a list. But we really want an account. And these accounts have been pretty hard to come by. So if we could say that aesthetic properties are kinds of aesthetic value, then that's a characterization, if not even a definition of aesthetic properties. That's the reason why Exangle accepts the kind thesis. That's one reason to be interested. Another reason is that the kind thesis illuminates the relationship between aesthetic properties and aesthetic value. So, uncontroversially, things have aesthetic value because they have aesthetic properties. So, we can ask, why is aesthetically beautiful? Because it's majestic. So, there's a because there. But what exactly is the metaphysical relationship that explains how things have aesthetic value because they have aesthetic properties? Here's one answer. Because aesthetic properties are kinds of aesthetic value. So the relationship is like that between scarlet and red, or between being a ginger cat and being a cat, etc. And the third reason is that if the kind thesis is true, it constrains in certain ways our theorizing about both aesthetic properties and aesthetic value. So for instance, if aesthetic properties are kinds of aesthetic value, then it can't be that aesthetic value is objective while aesthetic properties are subjective, for example. I think this is the point where there is more to say. But if there's like an important systematic relation of this sort, then that constrains our theorizing about both in a very, very tight way. Okay. So now here is an overview of my argument. I'm going to say that the kind thesis can be read in two ways. There's a straightforward reading, one that's sort of the most obvious, that's radically implausible. I'm going to argue that no one should accept that view. And in fact, after I show my argument, it may actually seem to be a straw man argument. But then I'll argue that the obvious alternative to that, and indeed the only alternative, which avoids those problems, is in fact unavailable. And because of that, we have excellent reason to reject the kind thesis altogether. Okay, so here's the straightforward reading It's the overall kind thesis. So aesthetic properties are kinds of overall aesthetic value. By overall aesthetic value, I mean the property of being aesthetically good or bad overall, all things considered. Not good in this way, bad in that way, but the final judgment that we would give on an object is the judgment of overall aesthetic value. Now, this account runs into trouble very quickly because of kind inheritance. So here are two clear facts, clear exponenda for any theory of aesthetic value that we have aesthetic properties that it kind account for. Some things are elegant, but not aesthetically good overall. Elegance isn't enough for something to be aesthetically good overall. It can be elegant, but have lots of other flaws that outweigh the positive contribution of the elegance. The overall kind thesis is strictly inconsistent with this because of kind inheritance. So here's an explicit argument to show that. Suppose that something is elegant. And suppose that elegance is a kind of overall aesthetic goodness, as the overall kind thesis claims. Then whatever has elegance has a kind of overall aesthetic goodness. But by kind inheritance, if something has a kind of overall aesthetic goodness, then it has overall aesthetic goodness. So it's guaranteed to be overall aesthetically good, not just good in this way or that. So that's something that's clearly wrong, that's entailed by the overall kind thesis. And here's another implausible consequence. Clearly, some things can be both elegant and monotonous. But if elegance is a kind of overall aesthetic goodness, and monotony is a kind of overall aesthetic badness, then something that had both would have to be both overall aesthetically good and overall aesthetically bad, but that's a contradiction. Because something can only have one overall aesthetic value by virtue of the meaning of the word overall. So, two things to stress here is that kind inheritance is, again, a strictly sufficient condition. There's no way something could have a kind of overall aesthetic goodness without being aesthetically good. And the other thing to stress is that we're talking about overall assessment. But this is exactly the point at which you might think that I have presented a straw man. I mean, clearly no one would ever think that elegance is sufficient for overall aesthetic goodness, but it may be sufficient for pro tanto aesthetic goodness. By pro tanto, I mean in some substantial respect, or in so far as something goes, it's reasonable to think that things that are elegant are always aesthetically good in some respect. So I may have just misrepresented the kind thesis, or at least read it in a way that's extremely implausible. So this is the obvious move, and it's a move that avoids both problems that I have been talking about. I just explained how it avoids the first problem. It means that things can be elegant, but not overall aesthetically good. It also avoids the second problem, because nothing can be both aesthetically good and aesthetically bad overall, but things can be aesthetically good in one respect and aesthetically bad in another respect. So there's no contradiction here in supposing that things can be both elegant and garish, so elegant, that probably is a contradiction, but elegant and monotonous at the same time, even if there are kinds of pro tanto aesthetic value, because things can be pro tanto aesthetically good and pro tanto aesthetically bad. So, here's a statement of the revised view. Aesthetic properties are kinds of pro tanto aesthetic value. We'll have a pro tanto kind thesis. Now, I think that this view fails as well. And that is for two reasons. first reason is it's unclear whether there are any protanto properties, and the protanto-kind thesis commits to them. And the second objection is that the protanto-kind thesis is not, in fact, a genuine alternative to the overall kind thesis, despite appearances of reduction. And I would stress that the second objection applies even if the first doesn't. Okay, so now for the first objection. So, if the kind thesis is true, then there is a property of protanto-aesthetic value. And because if you believe that there are kinds of P, then there has to be P. But this seems implausible. We actually have good reason to doubt that there are any protanto properties. Now this is a point where I think that can easily be lost on certain philosophers who are invested in certain debates, in metaethics especially, where the phrase protanto good or protanto bad are used very frequently. I think that there is a certain danger of reifying something that isn't actually property, that should be thought of in a different way. Now, here are some two concrete reasons for thinking why we should not think of that there are any protanto properties. So the first is to do with language. If you think about how protanto works linguistically, it's an adverb that modifies the main verb. So if you think about protanto oughts, which is one other reason, or one other usage of the phrase that's particularly prominent in the philosophical literature. So let's say that I protanto ought to donate to charity. Then it's that I protanto ought to do it, not that I ought protanto to do it, or to explain it in more human terms, it's I have a partial obligation to donate to charity. I haven't got an obligation to partially donate to charity. I mean, what would it even be to make a partial donation to charity? So, if we bear this in mind, then there's something odd about reading the claim, elegance makes something protanto aesthetically good, as saying that the fact that it has elegance endows it with the property of protanto aesthetic goodness. Rather, what we should read it as elegance protanto endows the object with aesthetic goodness. Okay, so this is the first reason to doubt the existence of protanto properties. Here is the second reason, which is to do with metaphysics. What is real seems to be an all things considered matter. So if we talk about the various ways in which protanto considerations make things the way they are, but the way that things are is the way that they are overall. So elegance makes a protanto contribution to the overall aesthetic value of its bearer. And it seems odd to play, so protanto plays a role in explaining how things are, but it's not, strictly speaking, part of how things are. So, I don't think that the arguments that I have given are entirely conclusive. In fact, I'll suggest later that we have some reason to be uncertain about many things about protanto. I think it's an underexplored philosophical topic. But at the very, very least, there's a controversial commitment that the supporter of the kind thesis is adopting here that hasn't been recognized. Okay, so that's my first argument against the protanto kind thesis, which says that we have reason to doubt the existence of protanto properties. But now there is a second argument. Right, so let's concede, just for sake of the argument, that there are pro-tanto properties. So I'm going to make the following claim. The pro-tanto kind thesis is not a genuine alternative to the overall kind thesis. And the reason for that is that pro-tanto and overall properties that correspond to each other do not differ in nature. They're the same sort of thing. The only way in which they differ is in whether they are partial, so whether they are pro-tanto or overall, but they cannot differ in nature in any way. That's a statement of what I'm going to argue. Now explain what it means. Alright, so the first thing to notice is that just as there is pro-tanto aesthetic value and overall aesthetic value, also I'm conceding to my opponent, there certainly are both, we certainly say that things make things pro-tanto aesthetically valuable and overall aesthetically valuable. So in the same way, we can suppose that there are both pro-tanto and overall aesthetic properties. So, for instance, we can imagine an outfit that's otherwise pretty elegant, that has a massive logo in the middle. It says like Hugo Boss or something, like massive obnoxious letters. And that spoils the elegance of the outfit. So here we've got an example of something that's pro-tanto elegant, but inelegant overall. And I think that that's a common sense distinction. I mean, if we set aside a commitment to pro-tanto properties, like we should certainly make sense in one way or another of our talk of pro-tanto elegance and overall elegance. Being elegant with respect versus being elegant with all things considered. Okay, so here is the crucial part. If the kind thesis were true, then pro-tanto elegance should be a kind of pro-tanto aesthetic goodness. And overall elegance should be a kind of overall aesthetic goodness. I mean, if not, then pro-tanto and overall properties that correspond to each other would have different natures. And they would have different natures because they have different kinds. So, the general claim here is that no account of a pro-tanto phenomenon should be different from an account of the corresponding overall phenomenon. Because if the accounts are different, in a different way than pro-tanto or overall, then the phenomena will be different. And the whole point is that the only difference between them is supposed to be their degree of impartiality. So what I take this to mean is that the pro-tanto kind thesis is no genuine alternative to the overall kind thesis. It's not a genuine alternative because we shouldn't be looking for accounts of any pro-tanto phenomena. The account of the pro-tanto phenomena, so for example the account of what kinds of pro-tanto aesthetic value there are, should just be read off the account that we give of what kinds of overall aesthetic value there are. Alright, so I'll stop there and I'll just briefly recap what I have said so far. So I've argued that the overall kind thesis is hopeless. It can't account for basic facts. I don't think it's a view that should be appealing to anyone. So the obvious route for escape is the pro-tanto kind thesis. And that runs into two problems. First of all, it's not clear if there are any pro-tanto properties. And secondly, even if there are, I don't think that the pro-tanto kind thesis is a genuine alternative to the overall kind thesis. Now, I should just say that we can still say that different things have different kinds of aesthetic value. We can still say that the aesthetic value of Yosemite National Park is different to the aesthetic value of the Norfolk Broads. And you can still say that that difference is to be explained by reference to their aesthetic properties. You can still say that the difference is that due to the fact that Yosemite is majestic and the Norfolk Broads are melancholy, for example, but we should be careful in not identifying aesthetic properties with these kinds of aesthetic value. Thank you very much.